Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind-Gut Conversation podcast, a place to learn about the latest ideas from thought leaders in the area of health, food, the science of mind-body interactions, and the environment. Today, I have the great pleasure to speak to Dr. Fergus Shanahan, a pioneer and thought leader in the area of the gut microbiome, as well as the founder and longtime director of the Alimentary Pharmacobiotic Center in Cork, Ireland, which he has built into the largest microbiome research center in the world. I had the privilege of closely interacting with Dr. Shanahan when we were both trainees and junior faculty members at UCLA. And I've learned to appreciate not only his wealth of scientific knowledge, but also his unparalleled curiosity and wisdom about literature, history, and philosophy, which he has applied to his writings and lectures. A good example of his unique view of medicine is his latest book entitled The Language of Illness, published by Liberties Press, Dublin, 2020, and which is available directly on Amazon. Welcome to the show, Fergus. Fergus, let me start with one general question, and then I would actually like to, follow this conversation to a particular topic that I was very excited hearing you speak about recently, about this unique population in Ireland. But let's start the conversation on a more general level. So you've also written and talked about, and a lot of people ask that question, is there a healthy microbiome, or what is a healthy microbiome? If you want to give your comments on that, I think that would be really interesting to the listeners.
Well, there must be something that promotes health. The microbiome is just a general word for the collection of living creatures in and on our body, bacteria, fungi, and viruses. And in general, they are a health asset. We know that from germ-free animals raised experimentally without any exposure to microbes. We know it's compatible with life, but we know they're not healthy. We know they have disturbed stress responses. We know they have a very poorly functioning immune system. We know their metabolic behavior is not normal. It's not comparable with, if you like, litter mates raised in the presence of microbes. So we know this. But actually, the science is not at the stage that one can very precisely itemize all of the elements in a microbiome that actually promote health. And I'd point out that health is not the same as normal. People tend to confuse the two. For example, in Victorian times, long ago, it was normal. It's actually 2 or 3 generations ago, but it was normal to have Helicobacter pylori in the stomach. That was normal. In fact, when I came back to Ireland after training in the United States, Helicobacter was in decline, but it was still a very, very substantial minority. But if you looked at elderly people, the majority of them had Helicobacter, the cause of ulcers and the cause of stomach cancer. So there was a time that we all had this, 100%. So it was normal, but you wouldn't call that healthy. Mm-hmm. And likewise, one has to be careful about even defining health. People have struggled with the definitions of health. The World Health Organization has a definition, but very, very few people could actually match that definition. And the more rigorous you try to define normal or health, actually, the number of people matching that definition seems to disappear. I like to think of us as all being slightly abnormal, slightly normal, somewhat healthy and somewhat unhealthy, because many of us are carrying actually genes and risk factors that may emerge at some stage to cause ill health. And a lot depends on the context. In other words, take an example of a preterm baby. A preterm baby has what you and I might call a normal microbiome. It's colonized with normal microbes. But because it's preterm, it doesn't have an adequate immune system. It doesn't have a mucosal barrier. Its blood-brain barrier is not fully developed. So in that setting, what we'd call a normal or healthy microbiome is a challenge for that baby, and it has to be protected from that. Another example might be the microbiome of an individual, a hunter-gatherer, say, for example, living in a part of the world where famine is quite prevalent. And they have a microbiome that is adapted to those conditions for maximal extraction of nutrients to keep them going in times of famine. Transplant that person now to an obesogenic environment in the Western world that most of us live in, and that particular microbiome might be a liability in that situation. And the diet that individual might, the Western diet for that person is a health risk. So one has to tailor these definitions to context of the individual. And that's simply the point I like to raise. And it brings me to the next point, which is it's very commonplace to see people refer to the word dysbiosis, meaning actually they have a long convoluted definition of it, but for most people, they use it interchangeably with either a change in the microbiome or some form of disruption to the microbiome, but used in a very vague sense. I don't like the use of that term because how can you say something is a dysbiosis if you find it difficult to define normal? So I think my reason for just making these distinctions is not to nitpick about grammar or anything. It's simply to point out the inadequacy of the state of the science at the moment, the difficulty we have defining normal, and certainly the difficulty we have defining dysbiosis, because much of what passes for dysbiosis is actually a secondary change, a consequence of the disease, or maybe even an appropriate adaptation to the disease. So that's why I think words are important.
Yeah, I mean, so you brought up this point that I've sort of also come to the conclusion that there's clearly not one healthy microbiome for all people in the world. So there's these different contexts, different environments, and if you take away, for example, some of these hunter-gatherer remnants, if you take away the deaths from or the mortality from accidents or snake bites or poisonous spider bites, the life expectancy seems to be actually quite similar to that in Western society. So it's not. So they have an optimal adaptation of the microbiome to the environment that they live in. It's when these it's when these transitions happen that's I think when bad things happen.
I agree. It is when the transitions happen, and particularly when they happen suddenly. But there's also risk to those of us in the first world. For example, patients are very vulnerable with any chronic disease. And so it's quite understandable that someone would say, doctor, is my microbiome normal? I keep hearing about all this science. Can you check my microbiome? Or you might have a scientist who's just curious. Mm-hmm. And there are numerous commercial outlets that will actually charge you quite a lot of money to give you an enormous printout on your microbiome, which is almost uninterpretable. And an isolated single microbiome check can actually cause more fear and concern and anxiety for a patient than relieve it. So people need to know that just a printout on your microbiome of itself without context is not very helpful, and what is vulnerable people are prone to exploitation with that. So I would advise people that information alone without perspective is actually just a higher form of ignorance. You need perspective on this. So people, if they want to have their microbiome checked, should know what they're seeking, what they're looking for, and should do it either in the context of a research setting or with a physician, clinician who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with this more than. Let me come back to this. So one idea that I think Justin Sonnenberg or the Sonnenbergs have sort of come up with, which I kind of like, is that the microbiota, because of their richness in genes, outpacing our human genes severalfold, that the microbes have the ability to much more quickly adapt to like dietary changes in that somebody goes in, that a population goes into, an individual goes into, and that but that the host, so that our body does not have that ability. It's much slower for our genes to change, take for 10,000 years. So there's this mismatch created between a rapidly adapting microbiome that then encounters an ancient or slow-moving body, and the immune system perceives that as a stressor, as a perturbation of its normal homeostasis, and that triggers. That's part of the reason that it triggers then this low-grade immune activation. Do you agree with that concept that we have this mismatch?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, the first statement that the human genome is not very tractable, meaning it doesn't change. It changes over a very long period of time. Now, it does change in the sense that it's not just about new genes or mutant genes. There are epigenetic effects, which are heritable things that affect gene expression. So one has that. But you're absolutely right that adaptation is a very slow process happening over generations. The microbiome actually can change far more rapidly. In many settings, that's probably a good thing. But we talked about these transitions that we're beginning to see with mass migrations. We're seeing these mass migrations now that never happened before, at least not to the same degree. And people coming from very, very different circumstances. They may be fleeing economic hardship. They may be fleeing from political hardship, environmental hardship, but it's happening on a huge scale. And there just isn't enough time for the host to adapt. And if you have a chronic mismatch with your microbiome, low-grade inflammation, it doesn't have to be florid to reach the level of inflammatory bowel disease. But just chronic low-grade inflammation does a number of things. It's very debilitating. It actually has an aging effect as well. We know that from other diseases, that chronic low-grade inflammation that might not be at a clinical level. You see it with chronic diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, or even, I always think, Crohn's disease. Those patients look older than their siblings, even when the disease is under reasonable control. So I do accept that this chronic low-grade inflammation and a disturbance in the microbiome or a maladaptation or something that's happened too fast. Yeah, I do agree with Justin Sonnenberg. Now, Justin has actually done some work on some of these migrant populations, or these populations that have undergone a change in their lifestyle. And in many instances, the primary feature that's leading to a microbiome shift is actually diet. Moving from, say, being hunter-gatherer to some other situation, or diet changing from the kind of diet that, say, farmers in Southeast Asia, when they undergo a transition to a new source of food, he's seen changes in their microbiome. It's not all due to changes in diet, however. As I suspect you'll probably ask me, we've looked at another ethnic group where, while diet was important, other changes were happening that generally are not measured or looked at in microbiome studies, but they're changes that are happening with modernization that are influencing the microbiome as well.
Yeah, let's talk about this population. So, I was fascinated. I mean, I saw some of the abstracts from papers that you published, but it's not been something that I was primarily interested in. I didn't even know exactly what the travelers are. So this is a unique population. I'm going to ask you briefly to describe that for the audience, who the travelers are, because I think very few people will know that unless they're Irish.
Agreed.
Sure. And then we can talk about the specific questions that you are addressing that are much more widely applicable to other populations.
Sure. Well, the population we're going to talk about, the Irish travelers are an ancient population. People used to think that they had been displaced from their land during Cromwellian times, when Ireland was ruled by Great Britain. That's responsible for some of the waves of travelers being displaced from land, but there is historic record of nomadic peoples in Ireland going back to the earliest centuries. So we've always had these nomadic peoples that interacted a lot with the settled community. They might help farmers during times of harvesting. They came and did odd jobs. They were tinsmiths. They had skills, but they had this nomadic way of life. and they moved all around the island. And they count nowadays about 1% of the population. They are recorded in poetry, in literature, and in art. And I've shown innumerable pieces of art which show the Irish travelers in their encampments, these large families in encampments that move around the country. Now, people will immediately think of the word gypsies, they will think of Romany, they'll think of Roma. Genetic studies have shown that the Irish travelers are truly Irish. They have Irish genes, and they are not in any way linked with European so-called gypsies, European Roma communities, or any other nomadic group. Now, there are other countries that have nomadic groups, but the Irish travelers are at least genetically different and have to a large part been confined to the island of Ireland. And I ran an inflammatory bowel disease clinic for close on 30 years for most of the south part of the country. And I calculated that I should have seen 30 to 50 travelers with inflammatory bowel disease, namely ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, during that time. And I never saw one. And it made me think, could these people be immune to this or resistant to this? Now, I mentioned ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease because you can't hide in the population with that. You might hide with a skin rash, or you might hide with some mild asthma, but you're not going to hide with something like that. And then I asked some colleagues, had they seen any other chronic immune conditions like multiple sclerosis? Once again, you can't hide with that. And the same experience was found, that they don't see that in the Irish travelers. So that was my, if you like, academic interest. At the same time, people have been writing about the microbiome, and Sonnenberg is one of the people that have referred to ancestral microbiomes, ancient microbiomes, that others might say non-industrialized microbiomes. These are people, some of them might be nomadic, like the hunter-gatherers. Some of them might be like the Hadza tribe in Tanzania. Others might be Peruvian farmers. Others are Mongolian horsemen. They haven't been well studied. Most of the microbiome studies are on people in the United States or Canada or Europe, the first world country. But when people have studied these non-industrialized regions, they find these ancient microbiomes that we might say have on the face of it look more, quote, healthy, unquote, to us. They tend to have to be adapted to the digestion and metabolism of fiber, high fiber foods. Whereas we have a microbiome in general that would be more adapted, not so much to fiber digestion, but to actually chewing and digesting the mucin in our gastrointestinal tract. Mm-hmm. The ancient microbiome also has fewer antimicrobial resistance genes, presumably because these societies have been less exposed to antibiotics and antimicrobials in general. And these ancient microbiomes, to get to the point, are not associated with chronic inflammatory conditions. The kind of thing you were talking about, that low-grade inflammation, or even high-grade inflammation rising to the level of inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, or all of the chronic inflammatory conditions that have appeared in the Western world since we've moved from an era where we had a simple ancient microbiome to a modern microbiome. Because most of our modernization, our diet, these have been things that happened in the last 50 to 60 years, maybe 70 or 80, but we've only had antibiotics for a relatively short period of time. Our diet has changed dramatically in recent times. Family size, refrigeration, the houses we live in, so much of what we come to know and accept in the first world, in the developed world, are relatively recent. And our microbiomes had to adapt to that. And it may be one of the reasons why we're seeing a microbiome that is ill-suited to the appropriate education of the immune system. Mm-hmm. And most of that happens in early life. So is it any surprise that our immune system might misbehave and go rogue and cause some of these hyperimmune conditions, like the so-called autoimmune conditions? So I was interested in this big difference between the non-industrialized and the industrialized microbiome. And the best way to study it is to look at migrants, people at transition, as you mentioned, people who move from one of these regions to one of the other regions. One would have predicted that they might, their microbiome might change, and they might start to acquire the risk of some of these chronic inflammatory diseases that we have. Or if one looks at a non-industrialized society that undergoes modernization, let's say they hit oil, or let's say they have some newfound wealth, and they start copying us in the West. They see television and they adapt to these new lifestyles. They are now seeing all these chronic inflammatory conditions that we've been experiencing for decades. But it's particularly noticeable when someone migrates, and it has been shown that their microbiome does indeed change, particularly if they migrate in childhood. And then they start, the younger they migrate, the greater the risk of acquiring these diseases of the new world. The later they migrate, the more chance they'll retain the risk of the old world. So what I think has been happening with the Irish travellers, I think the Irish travellers who've led this parallel existence in Ireland, that were once far more accepted and integrated, and even though they were nomadic, they were integrated. But as we've become, as the settled community has become more modernized, the Irish travellers have become marginalized, stigmatized, discriminated against, and even successive waves of legislation have pushed them off the roadside, and they're now no longer nomadic. They've been pushed into halting sites, a bit like reservations that one might associate with First Nation status in North America. They've been pushed into these halting sites. And I believe they are the last remnants, actually, of a group of people that retain what the settled community, what I and you might once have had if we'd been born several generations ago. So I think they're an ideal model to look at how did they retain this ancient microbiome? Why have they retained it? What are we doing to them that's hurting them? And can we learn from that and get the benefits of a first world lifestyle whilst not losing the benefits that would have existed in someone with a microbiome from a third world or in a developing country?
So, I mean, you wrote this fascinating article in Nature Medicine, you know, doing detailed microbiome and lifestyle analyses of the travelers. What are the main factors that you found in these studies that actually shape their microbiome, and and allows them to maintain it in an environment that's industrialized?
Yeah. So our first thought was it must be diet, because that seemed to be the case with some of the minority groups that Justin Sonnenberg has studied, and Justin has seen our data. So I assumed it was diet. So we were fortunate to have, at the outset of the study, very carefully assessed the diet of these individuals. And diet is important for the microbiome. Remember, this ethnic minority are impoverished, they're marginalized, they're stigmatized. So they have the health and microbiome of poverty. But their diet was not directionally different. They tended to eat more fast food, just like lots of poor people do. But there wasn't anything striking. We couldn't link diet with this ancient microbiome, no matter what way we analyzed it. Diet was not the determining factor. There were three primary determinants. And the first one was actually growing up in close proximity to animals, particularly horses. And it's noteworthy that the other ancient microbiome that we've actually been able to look at in the literature is that of Mongolian horsemen. And if you look at photographs, if you were to do Google and look into Mongolian horsemen, you'd see their immediate living conditions is rather like what you see with the Irish travelers. But it was exposure to horses, particularly in early life. Now, there are other animals as well, but particularly horses. So that was the first thing. The second thing was their family size. The average number of siblings in the study population we had was over 10.8, I think the number was, 10 siblings. Whereas the average for the settled or non-traveller community in Ireland, for the majority, is, according to the Central Statistics Office in Ireland, the government agency, is 1.3. And that's about the same as what it is for a lot of the affluent countries in Europe, which are losing their population as they become more affluent. So that's a huge difference in terms of, now, why would family size be important? Well, we actually have clues from earlier literature. We know from the times with Helicobacter, and we know from days with parasites and various other kinds of organisms, that actually you're more likely to share and spread and disperse your organisms if you're living in close contact, which you would be if you're nomadic. Mm-hmm. And you're more likely, if you're sharing the same bed, to share these microbes with each other. So there's the greater potential. Whereas if you're living in a big sanitized house with only 1.3 siblings living on some other floor, living somewhere else, you could go through your life and not share. You're having less contact with your siblings. So that would be one way. I don't think nomadism per se is necessarily influencing the microbiome, but it's the living conditions that are necessary, such as in a trailer van or a camping cart, that you have to have. And if you've got 10 siblings, 2 parents, and perhaps the grandparents as well, because they have these big, large and extended families, all packed into close quarters, they're more likely to share their microbes. And if the horses are involved in close contact with them, more sharing as well. So I think what we're seeing is horizontal transfer as well as vertical transfer down the generations. And I think they are the elements. Now, if you now compare that with the modern world, with fewer, smaller family size, we're living in big houses, and we don't have that immediate access to animals in childhood. It can't be just about animals, but I think animals have a big feature to it.
Talking about animals, I mean, this has sort of been looked at in the past, and horses have really never come up in my reading. It was always like growing up on a farm and being, and I looked at my own personal pictures from my childhood where I spent, summer vacations on the farm of my uncle, and I looked at these pictures, and it's always, very close proximity to animals that I played with, and in addition to digging out potatoes from the ground and not washing your hands before you eat them and all these things. But what's unique about? Do you think there's anything unique about horses that
well,
is?
No, I suspect there's nothing unique about them, but I think they are an interesting animal in the sense that, yes, they can transmit zoonosis. These are animal-acquired diseases, but quite uncommon compared to other animals. And if you look at a study done in the United States comparing the Amish with the Hutterites, and these would be people who came from similar situations originally in continental Europe, migrated to the United States, and generally were farmers. The Amish have fewer rates of allergies, much lower rates, and by that I mean a quarter the rate of the Hutterite in terms of asthma susceptibility. And if you take a photograph, a shot from the air, a photograph of the farms that the Amish have, you'll actually see that their barns and where their animals are kept is very close to the house, and they're scattered throughout the house, and they go around on pony and traps with horses. Horses are very integral to their living situation. The Hutterites are somewhat different. They have the higher rates of asthma. Yes, they're farmers, but actually they live in more communal setting where the horses and the animals are separated. They do have more mechanized arrangements as well, but they're further separated. You can easily see this from the photographs of their farms from overhead. So close proximity is important. But remember, it is statistically the case that allergies and asthma are more common in urban areas than in rural. But the margin of difference isn't enormous. Now, you mentioned that you'd been on farms in growing up, but you also grew up in a first world status as well, and you migrated to another first world status. The beneficial effect of the farm, I think, was probably quite diluted. I think having a big family and also living in very close quarters, you didn't probably have. But there's one other thing you didn't have and I didn't have, and that is that parallel existence. If you're stigmatized and marginalized and discriminated against, and this primarily happened in recent times, as the settled population in Ireland became more affluent. Remember, our nation is only 100 years old. We're in the centenary of the foundation of our state. So as we became independent and more affluent, this diversion happened. There was no intermarrying between these two, the majority and the minority. There isn't any social mobility between them. So the travelers had this ancient microbiome and retained it, and it never got diluted. I think the likelihood is now, as the settled minorities, if you like, impose our lifestyle on them, a series of legislation have made it impossible for the Irish travellers to live the lifestyle they've had before, unwittingly in some cases. But if you listen to Irish politicians, they'll say the solution to the traveller problem. And their solution is usually to try and make this minority more like the majority, make them like us. Now, think of the mental health consequences of that and all the other things. But actually the solution for the Irish travellers is actually to allow the Irish travellers to retain much of the lifestyle they had, whilst giving them the benefits of education and sanitary arrangements that the majority have, but not to remove the things that actually are favourable to their microbiome and to their health. And that the global implications of that, the Irish travellers, yes, nobody heard of them outside Ireland. It's only 1% of the population, but it's an important study model to actually tell the world that actually there are big implications for ethnic minorities if they're pressured to change their life. Some of those consequences are obvious, mental health, but some of them are not obvious. They're hidden until such time as you look at their microbiome. And we know the health consequences. We know what happens. We've been talking about what happens when your microbiome changes too soon, and if it's in the wrong context.
Yeah, so just expand on this. So, like in North America, the indigenous or First Nations, indigenous populations, a very similar situation from going from a nomadic lifestyle, and basically losing that and being on these. Being on reservations, a very similar phenomenon that has happened not yes. just recently, but over the last 200 years or so, and the consequences are devastating, for these populations in terms of alcoholism and mental problems and health and all this. So, I mean, the one question I have is.
Sorry.
Yeah, so the one question I have is, so some people would say, well, what implications, so this has implications for these minorities and for these migrant populations. That's obviously, right now it's perceived as a crisis, but I think it's just the beginning, that populations are being displaced all around the world and trying desperately to come to Europe and the United States. But what can the person that's not a migrant or is not in transition, what can we learn from this to sort of, I mean, obviously these societal changes and lifestyle changes will continue. There will be, fewer children even in families. More and more people will live in high-rise apartments in big cities, in mega cities. Is there anything that we can do in terms of either influencing, and as you said, so if the diet doesn't play the major role, what else can we do to sort of slow that or partially reverse it?
Yeah. Well, in some cases, diet will be playing the major role. It just happened in our circumstances, we were able to see differences unrelated to diet. So I'm going to list a few things of what we can learn, what the significance is. We began the conversation even talking about what's a normal microbiome, what's a healthy microbiome. So the result of this study with an ethnic minority, it does challenge the concept again of what's a healthy microbiome, what's a normal microbiome in a multicultural society. It does challenge that. For example, which person would you like to receive a fecal transplant from if you needed one? Which donor would you like? Would you like a non-industrialized microbiome, or would you like an industrialized type microbiome? And that's an important question. So it forces us to actually improve our science. The next thing that I would say is that we've been very focused on the vertical transmission of microbes. It is true, we get our microbes from our mother at the time of birth. And we've talked a lot in the literature about breastfeeding and cesarean section versus vaginal section, vaginal delivery. Those things are all important. But I think we've downplayed the importance of the immediate environment, our indirect transmission, or acquisition of microbes from our father, from our friends, from our animals, from our immediate environment, from the conditions that are imposed on us. We haven't sufficiently addressed that, what I'd call the social microbiome.
Mhm.
And so it'll force us to do that. And the studies of the ethnic minority just show us the significance and gives us a model to study that. Now, why might the social microbiome be important? Well, consider the elderly. Consider what we've been doing during COVID times. If the social microbiome is important, as is shown by these ethnic minorities, consider what happens as people age in society. They lose their friends. They go to funerals and have lost their friends. So they're in contact with fewer people. Their mental health is affected because they're lonely and they're alone. But separate loneliness from just aloneness. They're isolated. Many of them are living alone in single houses. Some of them then move into long stay institutions. Again, further diminishing their contact with society. And they may not be able to have their animal pet in a long stay institution. They may also even be just living in a single room in that institution because they're disabled and they can't walk very far. They're not getting out into the environment. They're not, remember, we don't just get our microbes from our diet and from our mothers. We inhale our microbes as well. The respiratory microbiome, that's where we get our microbes. We inhale it being out in nature. So the respiratory microbiome is every bit as important probably as the gut microbiome. So now you've got elderly people that are actually really isolated from any source of sharing of microbes. We need to learn more about these kinds of things. We probably need to have a hierarchy of importance of the things that can influence our microbiome. We put diet and antibiotics top of the list when we establish these hierarchies of importance of things that can influence our microbiome. But what about other things, as I just said, living alone? So there are other types of minorities in society that we don't actually address. And I've just mentioned the elderly as one of them. So that's another significance. But when I talk about these hierarchies of importance, we did a study not too long ago and thought we controlled everything imaginable. We did a study of patients with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. That's because it reflects my own interest. But we studied them in Cork and also in Winnipeg. Now, the significance of that is these are two cities on the same latitude, separated by about 5,000 miles, but they're on the same latitude on the globe. And they're both in first world countries, developed societies. And we studied them for every diet controlled, everything we could control that we could think of, age, gender, you name it. And what turned out to be top of the pile when we ranked the hierarchy of importance of things that contribute to the variations in their microbiomes: geography. Geography. Now, I don't know how geography influences that. I doubt it's latitude. It could be longitude. It could be climate, but I doubt very much that that's the whole story. I bring this up, Emma, to make the point. There are a number of things that we don't know about microbiome science, that we shouldn't become preoccupied on certain areas. We've got to learn more about microbiome science and studying outliers. Anyone who's different can tell us a lot. So the majority and most of the papers on microbiome science are actually about the majority. Moreover, they're actually about affluent, educated majority. Very few papers have looked at actually the impoverished society in our developed worlds. But my point being that the majority can learn an awful lot from the minority. And that applies not just to microbiome science, but to all aspects of the way in which humans live. So that's as a general statement. But I mentioned the elderly as a particular minority in society that some of our work with the travelers has resonances for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good point to end this fascinating conversation. And we could go on for a long time. And some of the things that you said, I think a lot of listeners have not thought about. And everybody's so caught up into taking supplements and doing the latest in sort of recipes and but I mean there's so much unknown. I totally agree with you that it's kind of so on the one side it's amazing how much we have learned in the last, I would say, 20 years only, or 10 years. But it's also equally amazing how much we don't know and how much we try to make conclusions now without really knowing the whole picture. So I think it's a, let me ask you one personal question. So knowing all the things that you do about the microbiome and health and low-grade inflammation, so what do you personally, you and your family do personally to respond to this crisis situation that the developed world finds itself in?
Well, what do I personally do? I do acknowledge my ignorance, and I certainly don't have a monopoly on the knowledge or any even aspect of it. I'm sufficiently expert to be wary of experts. So I don't follow celebrity actresses, actors, or even celebrity scientists. But I do some things that I think make sense. So when it comes to diet is one thing that is under our control. And since I've learned about microbiome, I have diversified my diet. Because I think, you know, when we eat, we're feeding our microbes as well as ourselves. And I think if you don't, we know from studies that if you don't feed your microbes, you may lose them. And you won't get them back simply by diet. So diversifying the diet, and by that, and also by going closer to source. I eat real food. I don't obsess about labels. I do eat some things that people might say are bad for me, but I think a little bit of what you like doesn't do you too much harm. I try to not take it to excess. But if I one summary thing, I'd say I just diversify my diet and try and eat a little bit of everything, but primarily unprocessed, natural, whole food. And that's as much as I can do for myself. And I don't blame people. I don't do fat shaming to people. I don't do any of those kinds of things. But I think it's one thing in my control is the diversification of diet. So that'd be the one thing I would single out, even though I said that I've been studying a group of outlying ethnic minorities where diet does not seem to be the primary thing favoring their microbiome. But I do think diet is the one thing that is under my control.
Yeah, great way to end this conversation. I mean, hopefully at some point, you know, we can have another session to address some other interesting aspects of this field. And so I would like to thank you. It was really wonderful. You know, I mean, we used to have these conversations, you know, decades ago with you about the immune system in the gut. So it's great to reconnect on this new level that involves not just the body, but also lifestyle and, you know, socioeconomic factors and geography. It's really fascinating. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Emmer, and good luck with all of your work. Thank you for chatting with me.